So, good afternoon. Guess it's past 12. So I thought I'd spend a little time going through the history of Vermont agriculture, basically from 1766 onward, just after the French and Indian War. It's a passion of mine. I do this as a sort of a hobby. I do a blog on it that I've been doing for years. Mainly because I believe in the old saying, if you don't understand the past, you can't appreciate the future. And obviously, the past is very important to understand. In 2014, some of us contributed to this book, The Vermont Difference, and it was done by the Vermont Historical Society and the foundation in a foundation, and number of about, I guess, 19 individuals wrote different parts of the future of Vermont, and I did a section on the history of Vermont agriculture at that time. It really covers all aspects of Vermont history, and you might want to look in the local library because I think a copy is there. I used to tell people when I did a stint as Vermont Ag Secretary, if you really wanted to look at diversification and change in Vermont agriculture, you should look at Windham County in southern Vermont, where I grew up. And they'd say, southern Vermont, isn't that White River and Raleigh? It's further down than that.
Part of Massachusetts.
But the farm sector that exists today is different than what existed in the past, and what exists in the future will be much different than what exists today. So I want to cover why the landscape has changed over time. As some of you probably know, much of the settlement of Vermont in terms of settlers took place after the French and Indian War in the 1763 period. And even though Brattleboro was chartered, I think in 1759 or so, the real settlement of this southern Vermont didn't take place until after 1763. And Brattleboro, like the rest of Vermont, was the biggest growing area of Vermont in terms of settlement. In fact, at one time, Guilford was the most populated town in the state of Vermont in the late 1700s.
Wow.
And Burlington was just a city all forested without any port access and anything else at that time. So southern Vermont really was settled very early, and the early settlers were what you would call subsistence farmers. They mainly came up from Massachusetts and Connecticut. 80% of them were of English origin and 20% were of Scottish origin. And at one time they wanted to call Vermont New Connecticut because of the area that the people came from. Of course, that didn't happen. So they cut the trees, of course, and brought a few animals with them. And the old saying was that the first generation cut the trees, the second generation pulled the stumps, and the third generation actually farmed. And the first commercial enterprise that took place was basically the sale of potash. And potash was made by cutting hardwood trees and then burning them and then putting the ashes into a trough and pouring water on it. And that basically is a lye substance, and then they burn that in a kettle to create a hard black substance. And the English at the time actually had merchants going around teaching people how to do this process because the product was shipped to England, where they got about $5 per 100 pounds. And it took about a ton of hardwood logs to make a pound of potash or perlite at the time. Eventually, the process for doing that was that they created a process called pearl ash, and pearl ash was a way of putting the product in the kiln and baking it so that you get the impurities out. And the first patent for pearl ash was by a gentleman in Pittsburgh, Vermont in 1790, Samuel Hopkins, who actually was the first patent, commercial patent, chemical patent, signed by George Washington, patent number 1, 1790, for the process of making pearl ash. And so if you want to know the first patent, commercial patent in the United States, it was to this farmer in Pittsburgh, Vermont, for making pearl ash, patent number 1, signed by George Washington. But pearl ash, actually, potash was a form of commercial bartering. In fact, in Brattleboro, Vermont at the time, a guy named Jonas Mann had a store in West Brattleboro, and it said that he exchanged bartering for different products for people who brought in the pearl ash or potash. And not only did they get groceries and other goods for doing that, but they got a mug of flip. And I said, what's a mug of flip? Everyone got a little bit of alcohol in the process going forward. So actually, that was the first commercial type of operation that took place. Champlain Valley, of course, Bernie probably noticed in the 1820 period was the grain-growing region in New England until disease and bugs, right? And competition eliminated that. But we were the breadbasket of New England in that period of time. It's kind of interesting, actually, that before 1820, about 1820, before the Temperance Union, Vermont had about 200 distilleries. Every town had a distillery, one or more, for making the alcohol from the grains and corn, rye whiskey, and several thousand gallons of apple brandy until the Temperance Union movement came in in about 1852 to say that now shall not consume alcohol anymore. It's kind of interesting if you look at the language that the legislature passed then to embrace the Temperance Union, which actually was introduced by Senator Goodhue of Brattleboro in the legislature. It basically says, no more drinking except for ceremonial abilities in church services. And I said, boy, church attendance must have really spiked at that period of time. But that really put an end to the alcohol production in the state of Vermont that was taking place up to that period of time. And of course, we all know of William Jarvis in Wethersfield, Vermont, who had been consul general to Portugal, which was then part of Spain, who took it upon him. He had been a merchant in Boston and was appointed consul general to Portugal, Spain, and when Napoleon invaded Spain, or Portugal, at the time, the royalty didn't want the prize flock that they had of merino sheep to be taken over by Napoleon. So Jarvis was in a very fortunate position of being able to convey upon them to sell him several thousand merino sheep, which he had transported to the United States, pretty much on the East Coast. And he decided to establish himself. He was very politically connected in Washington as well. In Wethersfield, Vermont, you say, why Wethersfield, Vermont, of all places? Well, he apparently had an uncle and relatives in Claremont, New Hampshire, across the river. And that was very convenient for that relationship. And Wethersfield, Vermont, in the early part of the century, basically became one of the most prosperous towns in Vermont at the time due to his bringing merino sheep in it. As you know, the merino craze took place. Farms were consolidated because of the need to have large grazing areas for sheep, and many towns had over 1,000 sheep. Shoreham, Vermont had 20,000 at the time. I think the height they had 1.6 million merino sheep in the state of Vermont. When you hear more cows than people, we have a lot more sheep than people.
How many sheep work in this area in Wyndham County?
I've seen the data, and I didn't bring it, but a fair number. But a lot of it was at Madison County, that's where the people were located.
It was off the wool.
All wool, pretty much, and they won awards in Germany at the World's Fair for having the best fleece and the best wool and the longest wool, and actually some people were paying, how much did I figure? They were paying upward $50,000 at the time for some of these sheep, which would be about $1.5 million today, in today's dollars for these sheep. That was a very prosperous industry, and I compare it to almost what's happening in dairy today in some ways, because it was prosperous but was being influenced by foreign trade, because they put in a tariff after the War of 1812, and the tariff basically boosted the price of wool, and that's when the sheep craze took place after that. And then in about 1840, the tariff was eliminated, and the price almost dropped in half overnight, and they printed almost in a short period of time over half the sheep in Vermont, because they couldn't sustain themselves. And of course, the railroads had come in later on, and then produced sheep in the West for about 25 cents a head, and then Vermont it cost upward $1 to $2 a head to do the same thing. So we didn't have the economics or the land base to do the kind of production. And some people at the time said, watch out, Vermont, in the future. You can never compete with the West, and don't try it again. Deja vu.
But that drove forest clearing.
Absolutely. Forest clearing.
Do you know what percent of the forests were actually cleared when the sheep?
I don't, there's data available by other, but that did drive the forest clearing.
And now they're saying we should go back to sheep anyway.
Well,
We got to milk them though.
no, we have gone back to some extent to sheep, but it was a very interesting period that really had a great impact on Vermont in the future. And of course, we were the horse leaders in horse trade as well. If you read the history of Randolph, well, not only the Black Hawk and some of the others, the Morgan, of course, we know the history of, but Randolph, Vermont was noted for the mule trade, and they actually had mules that they shipped to the West Indies and for streetcars in New York City. If you read the history of Randolph, Vermont, and some of the things that had taken place. And of course, hops and hemp. We produced a lot of hops back in the 1800s. And the interesting thing on hemp, if you read the history of Fairbanks Scale Company, Fairbanks Scale Company actually started out producing hemp, and they were very involved, but they needed a way to weigh the hemp, and so they developed a scale and found out that was a little more profitable than hemp, but hemp was used mainly for rope. So a lot of interest in those industries at the time. Later on, of course, after the demise of the sheep industry came back a little bit in the Civil War, and we all know why. War uniforms came back a little bit there, but it pretty much died. And then the farmers were looking for something else to do, and up until that time, everyone kept a few cows for making their own product, and the women made pretty much butter in their homes. And so the old timers said, well, butter is where we can maybe have a future and on the landscape to replace sheep. And the old saying at the time, if you read the old yearbooks of agriculture, they say, to make good butter, you need 4 or 5 ingredients. You need good cream, You need good salt. You need good water. You need good churn, and you need a good woman. And the last is the success of the product. That's in the book. It's a quote. But basically, by 1850, Vermont became the butter capital, pretty much of New England and the rest of the country. And St. Albans was where most of the butter was produced. And whole industries sprung up to support the butter trade. In Montgomery, Vermont, for example, there was two big sawmills or mills that were put together to make the butter boxes that they shipped. Butter, Stowe, Vermont, had a big industry for doing so. In Bells Falls, Vermont, there was a Vermont machinery company that made churns up into the early 1900s. They made churns and farm equipment and everything related to the butter industry at that time. And if you look at what happened, of course, is that that Napoleon relative, he gets in the way pretty much. Napoleon III decided in the late 1800s basically that the military and the general population over there needed a form of animal fat, low-priced animal fat. So he put out a competition to find somebody that can make animal fat type butter out of beef tallow. And the scientists over there came up with a product, and they called it margarine. And basically what happened then was that eventually a French company decided to buy the patent. The company called Jergens decided to buy the patent. That company basically was bought up by Unilever, Ben & Jerry's Unilever. The patents were sold to companies in the United States, and by 1887 period or so, there were several New York companies making margarine. And what do you think the dairy industry did?
What did you say?
What did the dairy industry do? It's sort of like what's happening now with soy milk and all that. Same kind of approach, right? How can we stop this from happening? Vermont, New Hampshire, and other states said, well, the way we could stop it from happening would be to require that the product be colored pink. Pink margarine. And that case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, who said, well, the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, which says that one state cannot interfere with trade with another state unless it affects human health. The U.S. Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. You can't require a product to be colored another. You can, so the product can be shipped in, but it has to be in its natural color. So it's shipped in white. And I don't know if some of you are old enough to remember the squeeze packages that came with margarine back then.
My mother would never buy one.
Your mother never buy it?
No.
You got the white margarine,
We got butter.
and then you got the yellow color, right?
Yeah, but I was the only girl that ate butter.
Ah,
Really?
Yeah, in Des Moines, Iowa.
and you didn't squeeze it together?
Yeah, and I was so jealous because the neighbors, they had that kind.
They make
My
margarine.
dad was a doctor, he ate butter.
Right. Well, the other thing that the states did too is they said, even Vermont was party to it, and they said, if you go into a commercial establishment where they serve food, they have to serve you butter, the real thing, and if they don't, you can contact the local constable, and there'll be a fine of $50, and you can get half of it. You'd make a complaint. Wow. Now, the state of Wisconsin had that in place until about 5 or 6 years ago. And yes,
What was the yellow coloring made from?
food dye.
Food dye.
Food dye.
Food source.
That was why my dad wouldn't let us eat it. Because you didn't feel it was healthy,
Healthy, it was a food
but it
product.
was cheap.
Yep. And in fact, Canada had a law in place until 1948 that banned all margarine. And Quebec dairy industry had one in place until 2008. How it was enforced is a question. But, and then they had a tax on margarine until basically 1950 because actually a member of Congress back in that period of time for Vermont was very instrumental in putting in a margarine tax that taxed margarine in such a way that would be uncompetitive to butter. What's happened over a period of time, of course, is that butter now is outselling margarine. Because now they're saying butter's not bad for you, right? They did for a
Well,
while.
margarine was sort of pitched as healthier, wasn't it, for a while?
For a while,
Yes.
Yeah, it
yeah.
was supposed to lower cholesterol. That goes
Yeah.
back to the
And it's
1850s.
no longer made available for that anyhow.
But butter helps your brain.
Butter helps your brain. Yeah. And, during the butter period, of course, the other thing that was developed was, the proper genetics was brought in terms of animals to help. And that's when the Jersey breed and the other breeds were brought in. The Billings Farm in Woodstock brought in the Jerseys, and the Holstein cow was actually brought in through a seafarer in Boston, and the Holstein Association started in Putney, Vermont, originally, in somebody's house.
Wasn't it where the Greenwood School is right now?
Well, it started in Putney.
Yeah, that's what I think it's where the Greenwood School.
Yeah, started
I just learned that.
in Putney, and the other breeds were brought in that period of time to increase the genetics of the cattle in the state going forward. But the margarine wars was a very important period of time. In fact, if you look at St. Albans, do a little bit of history, some of you remember the Hunt brothers doing the silver trade and trying to corner the market with silver back in about 1977, 78.
Right.
And there was a butter trader up in St. Albans back in the 1850 period who tried to corner the butter market. And he bought up 1 year all the butter, stored it in the warehouse, and sold it off. It's an interesting story. It's in the old yearbooks of agriculture. And sold it off when he knew the price would get higher. He was successful the first year. The second year it didn't work. They got on to him. But he tried to corner the butter trade.
So taking a lot of ice.
Take a lot of cooler, ice, ice and sawdust and all that to do it. And then, of course, Vern, you know about the growth of the apple orchards in the state and all that that took place as well.
We were just talking about this the other day. Wasn't Scott Farm the first to have controlled storage?
I believe so. Yeah. And of course, with the blueberries, Bill Darrow Sr.'s brother George, who worked at the experiment station down in Maryland, that the high bush blueberries that they brought up and had put around to test the growth.
Started the industry pretty much.
Yep.
When was the year in your area back then, of apples in the blueberry?
Well, the first apple orchard was the Isle of Lamont up in Vermont. It was the first commercial orchard in the state back in 18.
Oh,
Blueberries were probably the 40s.
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 The high bush blueberries.
Yep. So along the way, there's been a great deal of diversification that has taken place in agriculture over a period of time. And of course, education was a very important element in what took place. In the 1930s, basically, the ag societies were put in place, and Vermont followed what was happening in other places with these so-called ag societies. And ag societies basically were the beginning of what was the county fair movement. And in the United States. And we had it in Vermont, and, you know, one of the interesting periods at that time with ag societies, which were the first educational vehicle for the farm sector, county fairs, was when George Perkins Marsh gave his 1847 speech to the Ag Society of Rutland County, basically saying you need to understand that man and nature need to work together, because before that period of time, of course, people came up, destroyed the countryside, they cut the trees, and that led to a lot of pollution and siltation of streams, and changed the whole system of Vermont. And it's the importance of man and nature, and that led to the 1864 Man and Nature book, which was pretty much the beginning of the conservation movement in the United States, many claim. But these ag societies basically were the county fair movement that still exists today in many places in the state of Vermont. And Governor Holbrook of Brattleboro, who was pretty much an agriculturalist, he had spent some time in his early life traveling throughout Europe, learning about what was happening in Europe with agriculture, soil health, all sorts of things, was the first president of the Vermont Ag Society Association. And in fact, it's interesting if you look at that movement in the county fairs. Brattleboro had a very active fair up with the fairgrounds back in the 1890s, and they said they'd have 20,000 people over a 2-day period. They'd close off all the businesses in downtown Brattleboro just for the fair. And the retreat farm was a key part of that activity up there. And it was known as one of the agricultural fairs of the time. Governor Holbrook...
What year was that, say that again?
1890s. Governor Holbrook also invented one of the first swivel plows in the United States. We think of John Deere, but Governor Holbrook actually was one of the first inventors of the swivel plow.
What type of plow is that? It was like
Steel swivel plow behind horses.
Instead of doing that, instead of turning over.
Well, we turn over the soil, but it was steel and we swivel a little bit.
The blade itself was flexible, yes.
I don't know what the blade was flexible, but it's called a swivel. I've got a picture of it.
So that was how far back?
This was in basically about the 1860 period.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
When was John Deere? 1840?
1840s. It was a big competitor to John Deere. I'll tell you a story about John Deere, which is interesting. You know, he was a Vermonter, and probably about 15 years ago, I was at an event in Rutland, Vermont, and a woman with her husband standing next to me said, "I bet you don't know who was born here," and being a little bit of a wise guy. I said, "Yes, John Deere." And she said, "You're right, but there's more to the story than that." And she said, "I'm on the local historical society, and there's more to the story." I said, "Well, please tell me. I'd love to know what it is." She said, "Yes, John Deere was born here." And she said he had a blacksmith shop with a partner. And if you go to Middlebury, you can see the marker there where the shop was. And it burned. And he had an agreement with his partner that they would rebuild the shop. And that over a period of time that he would pay his partner off for his part of the operation. But he left town without doing it. And I said, "Well, then that's true, nothing runs like a deer." And in my fair, we had some people from Illinois came out from John Deere to visit with us, and I told them the story, and they said, "It's true."
So where did he go?
What? He went to
To Iowa?
no, to Illinois.
Oh, Illinois.
Yeah. So interesting, but actually, Holbrook was, at the time, probably just as well known in what he was doing as an inventor that John Deere was. Then, of course, the land-grant college system that was put in place by Justin Morrill, who was a U.S. Senator from Vermont, and ran as a Whig in the beginning, and then became a Lincoln Republican in Congress, and then ran and became a senator. He was a shopkeeper by profession from Stratford, Vermont, and pretty much, to some extent, self-educated. And he had this idea, which wasn't new. It really wasn't his idea, but as you know, in many things, it doesn't mean things can't be advanced. Sometimes the greatest compliment is that's his idea can be advanced, right? With great leadership. And he had this idea about creating some sort of specialized college system for educating the general public, because up until that time, you had some wealth to go to Yale or Harvard or one of these other institutions of higher learning, and he felt, as others had, even George Washington at one time talked about creating a level of higher education for the general public, like the military colleges in the United States. And so there were others who said, well, let's create a system called the land-grant system in the United States. And there was people like Alden Partridge, the founder of Norwich University, who said, and others who said, well, let's do like they are doing with the railroads, as well as with the Homestead Act, and let's figure out a way to use some of that western land to underwrite the development of these land grant institutions. Any of you go to a land grant? Yeah.
So how did that system work? Could someone basically start a college if they got a bunch of
Well,
kids?
I'll get into that. So basically they get 17 million acres of land were set aside for being sold to raise funds. And if you weren't in that part of the country where the big western lands, the former Indian owned by the Native Americans, because the railroads got 130 million acres, and others got land grant, became important in that too. And he talked Abraham Lincoln into signing this bill in 1862 that set aside that 17 million acres. Probably wouldn't have happened if you read the documents if the South had not succeeded from the Union, because the Southern senators were against it, according to the records. So the timing was right. Everything's about timing, right? And it passed, and
they threw in military science.
they did military science.
Civil War, so that helped pass it.
Yeah, military science, because that helped pass it as well, and you had to offer military science and the applied arts as well. So it passed, and Vermont, Justin Morrill, actually Andrew White of Cornell, and then minister to Germany, called the act the greatest contribution since Hamilton argued for the U.S. Constitution. And I think 60 million people since have graduated, and about 3 million a year from land grants in the United States. People don't know, but MIT is a land grant institution.
Really?
Yep. People don't know that, right? And in the beginning, actually, Dartmouth was a land grant in the beginning, because...
And then Norwich, Middlebury.
Yep. In the beginning, Norwich and Middlebury and UVM, Justin Morrill, who was the father of this act, wanted Middlebury and Norwich and UVM to come together to be one land grant. In fact, the legislature passed a law, the Vermont legislature, to enable that to take place.
Wow.
And Norwich was for it because of Partridge. UVM was for it, but Middlebury didn't think it was a great idea. For whatever reason, history will tell.
So how did the land piece work in a state that didn't have the...
They had
Western-
scripts that they could sell. They had scripts. And I said sometime it'd be kind of interesting to track the money and see how it actually was used.
So states got allocated some of that western land and could sell it,
Sell the
raise the
interest.
capital.
Yeah, sell the interest in the scripts.
Are you talking about, when you're talking about the 17 million acres, where were they?
Excuse me?
Where-
They're the Native American land in the West.
In the west?
Yeah. Like, they gave 130 million to the railroads at the same time.
You're talking about federal lands.
Well, they called it federal at that time.
No, I meant, excuse me, I didn't mean that. I meant it was the whole continent, across the country.
Yeah, land that hadn't been
I didn't
actually
mean
owned.
to call the.
Land that hadn't been actually owned at that time. So there was a great deal, and if you read the history of, so UVM basically decided to be the entity that would be the land grant. And it's kind of interesting to read the history from that period of time, 1863 to 1890. UVM did not graduate, supposed records, anyone from the College of Agriculture. And so the Grange came in 1890, and as you know, the Grange was a very active political entity in the late 1800s. They came in and petitioned the Vermont legislature to take the land grant away from UVM. Always that tension there, because actually UVM is both a statutory and a private side to it, like Cornell does. And they marched several thousand people on farmers on Montpelier to argue to take the land grant away from UVM. And the supporters called in Justin Morrow and others to say, we'll clean up our act. And the House passed a bill to change it, and the Senate didn't go along with it. So UVM did clean up their act and started graduating people from the land grant institution.
Can you say more about why they weren't graduating people in that department?
They didn't say, but there was a lot of feeling that the arts and sciences in that part of the university did not support the ag side that was seen to be lower class.
So the applicants might have been there, but the applicants might have been there, but there just weren't the programs to
Well, there just wasn't the support needed
financial
to, yeah.
or
But they
faculty.
did change after that, of course, because the president of UVM at the time agreed to change their approach, or tried to change their approach. So it's an interesting time. And then, of course, the Ag Experiment Station was put in 1887. The whole Ag Experiment Station approach in the United States was a European model, first one created in Connecticut. And
The university.
yes,
It's the only one that's not associated with the university.
that's correct. Yep. And Vermont created one, the legislature actually created it in 1887, based upon what they saw in Connecticut, and enabled it with state law. And of course, others are pretty known today. I mean, UMass has the cranberry one, right? And Cornell has pretty much apples and grapes, potatoes. And I don't think anyone knows Vermont has one anymore, do they?
Well, I don't know, but that was the Hatch Act, right?
Hatch Act.
So that funding still is in the federal law here to fund a certain portion of the research at these land grants.
And of course, you know, as Vern knows, many of the grapes that are grown in Vermont now come from research that was done at the University of Minnesota, the Cold region of the grape. So there's a lot of work.
How much of the research has to do with the genetic modified products?
I don't have an answer for that. Don't know.
That's out at Iowa State. It's now Iowa State University. But that's the other big ag school.
Well, there's several big actually. Purdue, Iowa State,
Florida State,
Florida State,
Texas A&M,
Texas A&M,
Yeah.
Davis.
Davis, yeah. A lot of big ag schools around the country.
Does Vermont have a corner on research for maple?
Well, we are the biggest in the United States in terms of continental United States. We're the biggest maple producers. But Quebec does 4 or 5 times production a little bit.
I mean, as far as research, the Proctor Station,
Yeah.
UVM is really strong,
Yeah.
Cornell has a really strong,
Yeah.
but I don't know, there must be something up there in Wisconsin, Minnesota, but it's Cornell and UVM probably.
Cornell and UVM being the strongest because of our, and, you know, at the state level in early 1900s, it's kind of interesting on education, the president of AT&T at the time, Theodore Vail, created the first, what I call applied ag school at Linden State in Vermont. And if you read the history, it's kind of interesting because the person who was the head of the education in Vermont, State Department of Education, said, you know, before they created this school in Linden, he said, I used to recommend students that couldn't go to college to actually commit a crime, because then they could go to the weak school, Virginians, and get a better applied education.
Yikes.
Yeah, yikes. But, you know, he created that, and then after that, they created the school down in Randolph, and they stopped doing the education in Linden State, and then became the Randolph Institution. And of course, the Extension Act and vocational laws in the early 1900s, and you know, in Windham County and other counties across the state, they had county extension agents and home economists, right? Ray Pelso.
The Farm Bureau actually started.
Farm Bureau.
Already had extension.
Farm Bureau Extension was part of the Farm Bureau, which started in Broome County, New York, actually, at the
They
time.
would buy somebody a Model T, I guess, and
Yeah,
send them out to the farms.
yeah. So the county agent, home economists side was very important, and they were considered to be gods almost. Just like today. Just like today. You know, transportation actually was a very important element in agriculture then, as it is today. And the turnpikes were actually enabled by the state legislature in the late 1700s. And the Windham County Turnpike all the way from Bennington, which is the old Molly Stark Trail, to Brattleboro, had 5 outlets, 5 totals on it. And many people tried to get around it. And for agriculture, they did let you through without paying a toll. But they were private entities, and they were called turnpikes, many of them across the state, you know, at the time. That's the way that they were able to try to get better road systems, was enabling local people to create these turnpike systems around the state. And then, of course, the canal transportation system that took place, and that is real history right out here. And of course, the first canal chartered in the United States was in Village Falls, in 1792. It actually built in about 1807. The third one built, but the first one chartered in the United States was the Bells Falls Canal, and by an English company at the time. And eventually had traffic going all the way to Hartford, Connecticut on these canal boats, which were about 70 feet long, 11.5 feet wide. They drew about 3 feet of water and could carry up to 30 tons on them. And they had spike and pole men. They had little sails with two guys with a 20-foot pole pushing. And then where they had to get through the rapids, they had oxen or mules on the side with ropes that they could pull them through. And Brattleboro was a very important part of that system. In Vermont, several commercial establishments actually had boats going out of Brattleboro down to Hartford and back, and it says one firm actually had products that they shipped from Hartford that went on all the way to the West Indies. And that same firm in Brattleboro had a slaughter plant on the island that existed over here, where they cured beef tongue and everything else, and then reshipped to the West Indies afterwards. So a big trade took place out of Bradford.
Do you know how many locks they had up at Bell's Farm?
No, well, I don't.
Would have multiple.
Locks to get through, yeah. But the first one in the United States. And that was a canal craze that really took place during that period of time because they wanted to create canals all over Vermont. They wanted to connect the Wells River up over the land through Lake Champlain on the other side. The Onion River Canal Company, they called it, all sorts of surveys that took place. That didn't work for a lot of reasons. And of course, that period of time, you also had the Erie Canal in 1823 period. D. Clinton's folly. Thomas Jefferson said at the time when Clinton proposed that the Erie Canal be built, he said, he's got something wrong in his head to propose something like that. And yet it was very successful. New York City became the largest port in the United States. Over 60% of the U.S. commerce moved through that canal at one time. It changed the whole economic landscape of the United States in terms of people moving west and products moving
I just heard in Jill Lepore's History of the U.S. on the way over here,
Yeah.
or this morning, mattresses went from $50 to $5.
$5. Yeah.
And the passage from Rochester to New York went from 30 days to 6 days.
Yeah.
30 to 6
Wow.
days.
And a ton of grain shipping, a ton of grain went from $100 a ton to $10 a ton, almost overnight. So it changed the whole complexion. And then, of course, connecting the Lake Champlain Canal at the same time to change the whole complexity of agriculture in Vermont as well as other parts of the Northeast going forward. In 1827, there was an attempt to create steamboat traffic on the Connecticut River. They had a steamboat called the Barnet at that time that they tried to bring up the river to Brattleboro. If you read the history of it, it's kind of interesting because they had a big celebration down here. And they brought in according to the history, they brought in Burgoyne's cannon from the Battle of Bennington. And they had a big celebration. Big event. And apparently, as the steamboat was approaching through the rapids, the captain fell off and almost drowned. They pulled him up on the boat eventually, got him out of the water, and he survived. But it was not a good event for Burgoyne's cannon from that period of time. And then in 1840, they tried further to make steamboats work, and there was a steamboat they built. They had actually built by a company down in Massachusetts called the Greenfield. And just south of Northampton, they were pulling the water barges, and the boilers blew up. And the captain of the boat, as well as the first officer, who was from Brattleboro, Vermont, as well as the designer, did not live, and that pretty much ended, even though they had this authority they created to create steamboat traffic on Connecticut River. That sort of put an end to the whole future of steamboats. And of course, the railroads started coming, and that really put an end to the whole canal craze that was happening at the time. And of course, before the railroads, the history of the drover drives of cattle and turkeys and different animals all the way to Boston and all the way to Albany, overland, that took place. A wonderful history of these drover drives. And at one time, a little bit of history said 10,000 per year moved over the roads through Keene, New Hampshire, 200 to 400 at a time, to the markets in Boston. And they talk about the turkeys being driven as well. And to drive the turkeys, when it got dark, they'd roost in the trees, or if they go through a covered bridge, they'd roost in the top of the covered bridge. And they would have to wait until morning before it got light to get them down, and then they would sprinkle some food to keep moving. I can imagine how tough that turkey was when it got to Boston. Well, these were called drover drives.
We have so many turkeys in my house right now.
Yeah, I call it, cattle dealers without trucks. And at one time, Vermont was looking at how further diversify its agriculture. And the legislature in what period was it? About 1845 encouraged the growing of mulberry trees and silk growing in the state. And that really didn't take off very well because it took about 4,000 cocoons to make 1 pound of silk, and over the period of time, and 2 mulberry trees to make a pound of silk, and over a period of time, they only encouraged the development of 250 pounds of silk. We didn't have the temperature or the ability to have that kind of industry. But, so the intervention period basically took place, if you look at agriculture, beginning really in the 1829 period of time, after the stock market crash. But a little bit before that, actually, the United States created a commission appointed by Wilson at the time, following up on Roosevelt's Rural Life Commission. Some of you might have read that. That in a period of 3 months and went throughout Europe, Russia, Europe, and Egypt, to determine what was happening to agriculture credit in those countries. This was about 1913, and they came back and they recommended the federal farm credit land bank system. That came out of that approach. In 1916, the legislature in Washington created a land bank system, basically came out of that approach. And of course, you think of what leads to policy changes, it's usually some crisis of some nature that lead to these changes. In 1906, you had the Food and Drug Act because of Upton Sinclair and the migrant population in Chicago that was being mistreated and what was happening to the slaughter plants and the meatpacking industry. And that led to that act. And if you read the history of the maple industry in Vermont, of course, they got behind creating the Food and Drug Act as well, because Chicago apparently was producing more maple syrup than Vermont was at that time. And so there was a great concern about that. And that led to the Meat Inspection Act as well. And the growth of ag cooperative movement basically came out of the Grange movement in the late 1800s because the Grange took on the railroads. Very activist group at that time. The Grange took on the railroads, they took on big industry. I had a friend a few years ago who said, gee, she was a real activist, and she said, I tried to join the Grange and they told me I was too much of an activist. And I said, they don't know their history. They don't know the history. Because the Grange was very much an activist organization back then. And then the Ag Adjustment Act in 1937 that came out of basically the stock market crash and what happened there in that period of time. And if you look at Vermont, became a fluid milk state in about 1890 when the first milk train went that was followed Vermont to Boston. up until that time, we were pretty much a butter and cheese state. We had 186 creameries and 66 cheese producing plants in the state up until that period. And so when milk started being sent to Boston, there was a concern about farmers getting a fair price. This was World War I. And the price administrator in World War I for the government was Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover came to Boston and said, we need to figure out a way to create a more favorable pricing system for dairy farmers in New England. And so we got industry together with the buyers, and they said, well, the way we're going to do it is that we're going to create a two-price system. And the two-price system is going to be, we understand you have a flush period in production, and we understand you need a stable price, so we're going to create a two-price system. The two-price system is going to be this: you're going to get a higher base price, and then when there's excess, and we'll work with the buyers, when there's an excess, you'll get a residual price, so that you have that balance. And that basically led to the Ag Adjustment Act of 1937 with the market order system, which doesn't work today. But that's how it was intended to work during that period of time. And then, of course, the Soil Adjustment Act took place in 1930s, early 1930s, because of the Dust Bowl. Unintended consequences. They should have never plowed up the prairies, right? And when they did, federal policy opening up the West to settlers, promoting that. When they did, they plowed over land that should never have been plowed, and the dust blew across the country. And if you read the history, they even had rain, black rain, coming into Vermont when that dust blew across the country and blew into the White House. And of course, that led to the Soil Conservation Act with Hugh Hammond putting that in place. And later on, of course, the Rural Electric and Telephone Act, because rural America wasn't being served with electricity and telephone. I said to my late mother, now probably about 10 years ago, she's dead, I said, do you remember when you received electricity? And she said, yes, I remember quite well. The year was 1938. Your father was farming with his father in Brookline, and they brought one line into the house. And we had one 15-watt light bulb, and I said to your dad, boy, that's awfully bright, we'll never need anything more than that. and I said, and they said they refused to put it in the barn because they thought it would catch fire. Well, they had oil lamps, right? Change is difficult.
What year was that?
1938.
Wow.
1938. Rural Electric. And then you had 62, Rachel Carlson, the Silent Spring, right? About DDT. In fact, somebody sent me an email recently how USDA came out with a statement saying DDT is good for you. Shouldn't be opposed at the same time. So that, of course, led to real changes in terms of policy. And then Nixon with the creation of EPA in 1970, and then the Clean Water Act in 1972. I remember when I was in college, I took ROTC to earn my way through college. And we were down in Fort Devens at the time, summer training, and the Nashua River, anyone know where the Nashua River is? Runs through Pittsburgh. At the time, they told us not to get near that river because it was so dirty and so polluted. You looked at it, it was all brown gunk coming out of Pittsburgh and the paper pit. And today you look at it and it's very pristine. So the Clean Water Act and that changed things. And of course, we're back to the birth movement in the 1960s with the so-called hippie movement, really, which changed the whole landscape and brought some very positive changes in terms of how people approach local food and organic and local communities. In Vermont, and Brattleboro, of course, was a big part of that going through. Well, Vermont likewise has been very active throughout all this period in terms of trying to do things that can better support agriculture. The early 1900s with the cooperative movement, Act 250, when then Governor Davis came down to Windham County, pretty much, in Wilmington, and looked at what happened with people
That's,
building in Mount Snow and how there wasn't any real soil there to support the sewage flow into the runoff going in. And Henry Carse was appointed, actually a farmer from Heinsberg, actually an investment banker from New York City, that retired to Vermont as farmer. Wonderful guy, very down-to-earth, wonderful guy, who headed up the Carse Commission that came out and recommended that there'd be Act 250 that can somehow deal with the environment and growth and other things. Current use taxation in 1979 with the legislature, Dick Snelling, and purchase and development rights in the mid-80s, through the transfer tax, Housing Conservation Board, Governor Cunin, and other ways to try to address these changes that were taking place over a period of time. Vern knows this too, and I like to say when I look at some of these things, my mother said to me when I was doing the Montpelier job, she said, "Son, what are you doing this weekend?" I said, "I have a local board event." And she said, "What's that?" I said, "It's about local food." She said, "What's new about that?" What's new about that? But I'd like to say, Vern, you're in the middle of it, I'd like to say, it's new people doing old things with new technology.
Yes.
New people doing old things with new technology, which is delightful to see going forward. And of course, we all know that agriculture today is having challenges, not only in Vermont, but across the country. I think in early 2000 period of time, National Geographic did a piece where they said Vermont was the number 5 place in the world to visit, and the number 1 place in the U.S. And it was because we had these quaint villages, the working landscape, and the plan for the future. And I said, I like the first 2, third probably I'm sure. So that's a little bit of quick history of where we're at, but you've got people here who know a key part of it. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you. I can't wait to watch it on BCTV.
2 weeks. The relationship between the Grange, the local Grange, and the farmers in that area, was it kind of automatic that all those farmers would be a member of Grange, or was there a percentage that did not get
I don't know
involved?
the percentage, but the Grange was seen as it was a paternalistic organization that people moved through various levels based upon, the Grange had a sort of move through different levels of it, were very secretive in terms of going to the meetings, in terms of meeting, but it was a very active, and many people it was considered an honor to be part of the Grange.
Could you automatically be a member, though, or did you have to?
Well, you had to sign up, but
Yeah.
they didn't exclude many people,
Right.
but it was a very active organization.
And was the Grange not key for social life? For
It was a very
the
important part
farmer?
of social life.
That's where you met your wife.
Well, you met a lot of different people.
I think that was actually true, though. Commonly, that connection would
Yeah.
be made.
It was a very important part of the agriculture movement that took on big business, the railroads, and a lot of other things. It promoted cooperative movement and everything else. But like any organization, they change, and they're really, the influence is there. If you go to Washington, it's over at the Grange Building in Washington, it was some of the most valuable real estate. It's not far from the White House.
One thing I didn't know until recently was that Abraham Lincoln started the Department of Agriculture.
That's correct.
Sort of, I was thought it
Yep.
was a lot older than that.
Yep, and actually, Holbrook was very influential, according to the records, because he was on a committee in the state legislature that wrote a resolution asking Lincoln to create USDA. He's a real leader. People don't realize how much leadership. And was very involved in the retreat. He was on the board.
Related to the
It's Portrait House there.
Scott Farm Home?
Yes, yeah.
I forgot what I was going to ask. I'll get back to you.
Yep.
So what do you see as the future, Roger?
Jerry, hope to ask you. We're retiring about that. You know, I mean, the good thing that's happening, I think, is the real interest in local food and what's happening with a lot of people trying to meet that. You know, you deal with them every day. The challenge is how do you make that sustainable, right? Going forward. But I think the opportunity there is the fact that people today want to know where their food comes from, want to connect with it, really want to know who the producer is, but how do you make it sustainable, right? Part of the community.
I did. I wrote myself a note this time. Up until the early 1960s, I had heard that there were upwards of around, in this whole area, around Brattleboro, 100 working farms, and that it got down to, and I don't know, 1970s, 1980, it got down from around 100 working farms to one farm. Have you heard any statistic like that?
Hardly know, I didn't hear that kind.
I mean, it's a little tricky measuring farms, but according to the census, what's interesting is we've had about the same number of farms in Vermont, you know, from the mid-70s to now. It's just, it used to be 4/5 dairy, now it's less than 1/5, and there used to be a lot more land on average, but you only have to have $1,000 in sales to be counted as a farm by the census. So that's not like who's making a living farming. But that sounds, one farm doesn't sound, I mean, we've had working farms around here in town. I mean, Brattleboro has an ag committee, and there's always been a couple dozen farms in town. And now there's some new ones. It's not yours.
Yes, sir.
I was in construction like in the 80s, so this is not in the 70s. But it seemed to me like the farm was being sold and it was subdivided to make very large custom homes. So there was, to me, a kind of a waste of farmland. Because now we have all these large homes and nowhere to plant our crops, or not as much.
That's one of the reasons that Act 250 was put in certain acreage, because under that the statewide soils and prime soils are supposed to be evaluated on a certain size land acreage to deal with that, but it's
Yeah. Well, I think just from hearing what I've heard, you know, we learned, we went from the Dust Bowl to that. You know, farmers were maybe planting too much and not knowing that there needed to be divisions, boundaries, to keep the dust from coming so far. And then we go into 1938, the first power, and then what do we have? A storm that blew right through Vermont. So that was the part where we started to understand, okay, we got this power, but now we got trees to deal with. So, you know, we tend to make our problems, but then solve them. And that's what the political part is all about.
well, you know, part of farm policy over history and some in the past has been, who was the secretary said, get big or get out? Earl Butts, get big or get out. And so a lot of that size have been influenced by policy in terms of size and scale. In fact, on dairy today, over 50% of the milk is from farms of 1,000 cows or more in the United States.
Yeah. I may not sound like I know too much, because I haven't grown up in a farm, but I know that several generations of my ancestors were in Stowe, and they knew. They all
Yeah, well, the old timers who saw it's in the yearbooks of agriculture, which I read. The old timers who saw the demise of the merino sheep industry and then the changes taking place with the butter trade and how that was affected by economics at the time and transportation, said, you know, Vermont's future is never competing with the West on a commodity basis. You can never win on a commodity basis.
Yeah.
You always have to be the lowest cost producer in the commodity trade. And they said, if Vermont continues to try that, this was early 1900s, 1890s, they said they're going to find themselves in the same position as the sheep industry and as the butter trade. Deja vu, right?